It's time to begin Lecture 10, and actually on this particular lecture we are going to be introducing Unit 5. So if you'll get out your workbook for the class, turn to page 14, and you'll find the about two-thirds of the way down the page. We'll get underway with this next unit, the title being, Are There Any Lost 10 Tribes? And if I can just find my notes here. Let's see. Well, where did they go? Oh, I thought they were lost. Here they are. They weren't lost at all. Neither, as I hope to show you in this particular lecture, beginning the 5th unit of this Israel in Prophecy course, Part 1, neither are the 10 tribes. Now, in one sense, that's a type of sword that can cut both ways. The tribes, we would argue, are out there. They just don't, at this point in time, know who they are. One of the biggest challenges to this whole notion of a need for a course like this, to the concept of Israel in prophecy in terms of modern times, has to do with the challenge that's made that there really weren't any lost tribes in the first place. This is one of the most frequently cited objections to the entire concept of the British Israel idea. And there are two principal objections in this genre of critique. And I'll talk to you about them. Before I do that, again, let me once more reiterate. The 10 tribes are out there. They're locatable. They were lost. They are lost to the view of the world. And for that matter, they would be lost to everyone were it not for God's flipping of the switch, opening of certain minds, convicting certain individuals to understand and see the way these prophecies fit together, and to be able to locate them through the methods that we've used thus far and that we'll use on into the future lectures in this particular course. The two principal objections that oftentimes are made to the fact that there were lost tribes. Number one, you frequently find the argument that only a very small percentage of the population of the North ever really even went into captivity at all. The second criticism is, even if the majority did go into captivity, they or their descendants eventually at some future time return to Palestine. And we'll work our way through the next 3 and possibly even 4 lectures in this particular unit, exploring some of these arguments, delving into the explanations, the criticisms, and the ways in which those explanations and criticisms can be addressed and met and challenged, and I would argue quite successfully addressed, met, and challenged as well. One of the most scholarly books in regard to criticizing the idea of there being lost tribes of Israel and then locating them somewhere in the modern world among the peoples of the world is a volume, and you'll find this reference cited in your selected bibliography. It's a volume by Alan H. Godbey, the title being The Lost Tribes, a Myth, Suggestions Toward Reuniting Hebrew History. And I want to take a moment and read a quotation from a book review, actually probably a couple of observations. And I do this primarily to give you a sense of those criticisms that are out there. One of the things I think perhaps those of us who have analyzed and looked at this idea before in the past have done is we've tended to focus on those things which we believe are supportive and perhaps turn our back on or turn a blind eye to the critique and the criticism. And I don't think that's necessary. I don't think we need to do that. And it's the old adage of, know your opponent. I think we need to be very honest and very open in terms of what these criticisms are and what the opposing views are, and then look at them fairly and honestly and see the evidence on both sides of the argument, and then come to our own respective and particular conclusions, hopefully prayerfully with the inspiration of God in doing so. One reviewer of the Godbey book wrote a quite flattering assessment. It It came in the Catholic Bible Quarterly, 1975, volume 37. This is really a fantastic book, packed with such an expansive information that it almost overwhelms the reader. I've examined the volume, and indeed that's true. It's a really marvelous scholarly undertaking, although I disagree with the principal conclusions. The main thrust of Godby's works is to disprove the assumption that the northern tribes taken into captivity by Sargon II in 722-721 BC were lost in the welter of international movements following that event. Godby holds that only a small fraction of Israel was actually deported, and many of the other critiques of a less scholarly nature have drawn on that concept and incorporated it into their analysis and their work. Only the upper classes were involved, and they appear to have enjoyed considerable liberty in the places where they were settled. Godby has drawn upon literary sources that are still relevant and the best materials available in other areas to date regarding this publication. The 28 chapters packed with material are exquisitely written so that despite the length of the book, the reader never loses interest and enthusiasm. It betokens immense erudition, careful research, the ability to synthesize. He is well worth reading for his consummate passion for detail, his marvelously intricate tapestry of scholarship in an area where so much is tricky territory. And then another writer, writing in a German publication, observes that in more than 800 pages, Godby assembles everything known about the dispersion of the Jewish people and examines his file cards with the reading glass of a conservative Christian theologian. Much of Godby's book is devoted to the pricking of bubbles and old fallacies concerning 10 tribism. Godby concludes no 10 tribes ever really existed in the diaspora. Now, that by and large tends to be where worldly secular scholarship has come down on the issue. And I want to spend these next few lectures looking at a variety of issues, bringing in strands and threads from the Bible, from the historical works, the prophecies, and then works from secular history outside the Bible as well. The Lost 10 Tribes truly is one of the great mysteries of the ancient world. Much has been written. There are shelves of books that line the shelves in various libraries. Virtually everyone from the Japanese to the Afghans to the American Indians to the people of northwestern Europe have at one time or another, in one way or another, been connected to the Lost 10 Tribes. What do we know? Perhaps the best place to start, and the place that I'll choose to start this particular unit, is a fairly careful look and an examination of the history of the Israelite people as it's recorded in the Bible itself. Now, you'll want to have a Bible handy to take a look at some of the scriptures that we'll be examining as we work our way through this material. Turn over to Genesis chapter 48. In some respects, I suppose our story can begin there. The story, in essence, begins with the family of Jacob around probably sometime in the 17th century BC, seeking refuge in Egypt. The entire Fertile Crescent was overtaken or engulfed in famine-like conditions because of weather patterns which were adverse, which created the famine conditions which caused many people to be in great distress in that area of the world. I think I said Genesis 48. Let's go instead to Genesis chapter 43 to read about this particular account that we read of here in the history as recorded in the Bible. And the famine was sore in the land, and it came to pass when they, meaning Jacob's family, had eaten up that corn which they had bought out of Egypt, their father said unto them, Go again and buy us a little food. So it was a time of intense, great difficulty and distress. Jacob's family was one of many. Now the interesting aspect to this, and there's a lesson I suppose, at the level of the individual Christian, whenever we find our lives fraught with difficulties, tragedy, and trial, and ask ourselves, why is this happening to me? Jacob's favorite son, Joseph, was spirited away at age 17. He was taken as a prisoner of Midianite traders. He was transported from his homeland there in the Levant, taken down to Egypt, and for a period of 22 years separated from his father and from his various brothers. It took a while, but Joseph eventually came to have the big view of this incident, this life-shaping experience in his own life. Genesis chapter 45, Joseph, in addressing his brothers, when he finally did reveal himself before them, we read about that at in the opening lecture, Genesis 45 verse 3, he says that I am Joseph. He asks about the condition of his father, and then he looks. It says in verse 3, his brothers could not answer him because they were troubled, and probably with pretty good cause. The brothers, of course, being the ones that cast Joseph off because of reasons of jealousy and sibling rivalry. Joseph, verse 4, said unto his brothers, come here, come near to me. And they came near, and he said, I'm Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. However, verse 5, don't therefore be grieved, don't even be angry with yourselves that you sold me here. Because Joseph was able to see the broad picture and the plan. And in a sense, this whole series of lectures, the 40 hours that we will be presenting to you in this Israel and Prophecy series, it's aimed, it's targeted, it's carefully designed to do this same type of thing, to reveal that broader picture. To see the forest as well as the trees as we back away and begin to see the outlines of, in this instance, the national history of the descendants springing out of Joseph himself. Joseph got that big picture. Don't be angry that you sold me here. Why? Because God did send me before you for the purpose of preserving life, for saving the family. Jacob's family. For these 2 years has famine been in the land, and there's going to be 5 more, he says, in which you shall neither be earing nor harvest. And God, again, reiterating this theme, God sent me before you to preserve you a posterity in the earth and to save your lives by a great, a magnificent, and a wonderful deliverance. And indeed, that is what took place. If you drop down to verse 10, you find the family of Jacob being able to take up residence in an ideally suited territory, stretch of land in the northeastern reaches of the Egyptian Empire, in the Nile Delta Valley area, in a rich, fertile land suitable for their flocks and their herds, suitable for the sojourn that they were about to make over the span of many, many years there in Egypt, in this land, as it's called, of Goshen. Dropping down to verse 10, and you shall dwell in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near unto me, you and your children and your children's children and your flocks and your herds, everything that you have. You're going to bring that down. And in this time of difficulty, tribulation, trial, and famine, it says, and there, verse 11, I will nourish you, for there are yet 5 years of famine, lest you and your household and all that you have come to poverty. Then over in chapter 47, Joseph came to the Pharaoh, and he said, my father and my brothers, their flocks, their herds, all that they have are come out of the land of Canaan, and behold, they are in the land of Goshen. And he took some of his brethren, even 5 men, and he presented them unto Pharaoh. Pharaoh said unto his brothers, what's your occupation? And they said to Pharaoh, we are your servants are shepherds, both we and also our father. And they said moreover unto Pharaoh, for to sojourn in the land are we come, for your servant has no pasture for their flocks. For the famine is sore in the land of Canaan, and now therefore we pray you, let your servants dwell in the land of Canaan. And of course you know that's the backdrop, that's the point of beginning of the whole story of Israel growing from a family, a nuclear family with 12 sons, and ultimately expanding into an entire people. If you'll page forward to the book of Exodus, Exodus chapter 1 and verse 7, to kind of pick up with the historical story thread here. The children of Israel were fruitful, they increased abundantly, they multiplied and waxed exceeding mighty in the land of Goshen, where they had come to sojourn. That land then was filled with them. Now from that point forward opens up an interesting and fascinating story. It's a story which really becomes a paradigm, in a sense, a model, mapping out the story at the spiritual level, on the spiritual plane, of the salvation plan of God. To move from the biblical record, at least for a few minutes, and shift our ground to talk about the history. Different ones from Ambassador University and from that, for that matter, outside the context of Ambassador over the years, have tried to place the story of the Exodus in its true historical context. And there are a variety of ways in which this has been done. Most recently, those of us in the Church of God have placed it into a framework which I'll roughly outline here for you. We would find or locate the 18th dynasty of Egypt as being the dynasty where things begin to turn for ill in terms of the Israelites. A Pharaoh whose name was Amos, including the same word from which the name of the main figure for these next 4 books of the Bible will be derived, Moses. Amos, whose dates range probably from around 1570 to 1546 in what you might call the conventional chronology of Egyptian history. Amos began initiating certain policies transforming the Israelites into a slave people. Let's take a look. Go back to Exodus chapter 1. What we're going to be doing here is getting into at least some parts of the story that we taught at the old Ambassador University campus in the class we called Ancient Israel, from Abraham to the captivity. And one of the big issues or blocks of material that we dealt with was the chronology of the Exodus. Where does this fit? If these were real, genuine, authentic events describing real people who lived thousands of years ago, then they had to interact with some of the people that we see in the record of Egyptian history. Ironically and sadly for us, much of that history is not as clear as we would like it to be. We don't know with the absolute certainty where to place the events of biblical history. It becomes thus then a matter of faith. When we read about Amos, then, if we are placing this correctly in the 18th dynasty, we read in chapter 1 and verse 8, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt, which did not know Joseph." It's interesting because when we put together what we do know from the record of history about Amos the First, we find that he is a man who restores national rulership. The 18th dynasty displaced the Hyksos rulers. The Hyksos were a warlike Asiatic people who came into Egypt, who got control of the political system. For a while they ruled from a distance, but eventually it appears that they came in and actually set up shop and ruled as the literal direct rulers there in the kingdom itself. Over the centuries of Hyksos rule, which spans roughly in conventional chronology about 1780 to 1560, dynasties 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17 are the periods affected. These Hyksos, who incidentally were ethnically related to the Israelites or the Hebrews, they came to be much disliked. They came to be a people that the Egyptians, when eventually Amos came to power and expelled them and established nationalist Egyptian rule, there was great favor for that. Now, another side note, which has appeared in some of the literature of the church in years past, I'll just interject here to add to the story flow. If this arrangement and placement of the biblical figures is correct in this particular time frame, that would place Joseph as an Egyptian prime minister in the context of Hyksos domination. And in that sense, you have a Hebrew who would probably have been a little bit more readily accepted by the foreign Hyksos imperialist rulership of the land of Egypt in that time frame, if indeed we've located that correctly. Now, let's read a couple of more verses here. A new king arose. Verse 9, and he said unto his people, Behold, these children of Israel, they're much more and even mightier than we are. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass, when there falls out any war, they join our enemies, and so fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. Therefore, as the history unfolds, they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh treasure cities of Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted the Israelites, the more the Israelites multiplied and grew. And they were grieved because of the children of Israel. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar, in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service wherein they made them serve was with rigor. You have packed into this a tremendous pivot point where the outlook changes. Now again, we speculate that probably the Pharaoh who instituted these repressive policies upon the Israelites, reducing them to slavery, very likely, from what we know of the historical record outside the Bible, was a man named Amenhotep I. His dates would fall in conventional chronology 1551 to 1524. After him arose a man who very likely would have been the one who would have ordered the Hebrew babies to be thrown into the river. And you can read about that as you look in the remaining verses here, 15 through 22. Verse 22 being the critical passage. And Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, Every son that is born you cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. Thutmose I, dating approximately 1524 to around 1518 BC. Thutmose II was another remarkable individual, a man, Pharaoh, a Pharaoh who went by the name of Napoleon II. His dates would fall 1504 to 1450. He had a very lengthy reign. This particular Thutmose waged many campaigns and brought much territory, including a good portion of the territory of the land of Canaan, under Egyptian rule. We have speculated, and it may well be true if our chronology is correct here, that this Thutmose would have been the one that was Pharaoh around the time of Moses' flight into the wilderness of Midian. Verse 15 of chapter 2 in the book of Exodus. And this immediately follows the account of Moses confronting the Egyptian taskmaster, pardon me, not the Egyptian taskmaster, but the two Israelite slaves that were striving together with one another creating eventually a problem for himself politically. Verse 13, let's start there. He went out the second day. 2 men of the Hebrews strove together, and he said, And he said unto him that did the wrong, Why do you smite your fellow? And the Egyptian or the Israelite slave turned and said, Who made you a prince and judge over us? Do you intend to kill me like you killed the Egyptian whom he had killed? When he saw that Egyptian, back in verse 11, smiting a Hebrew, one of his brethren. Moses feared, and he said, Surely now this thing is known, and indeed it was found out. Verse 15, Now when Pharaoh, perhaps Thutmose, heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh, and he dwelt in the land of Midian. And he sat down by a well, and then there develops this 40-year period during which Moses is out and away from the main flow of what is taking place among his people, the Israelites. Now, one lively area of debate and one point of interest goes back to the question, who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? And a number of years ago, in the spring of 1987, if memory serves me correct, Keith Stump wrote an article that appeared in the Good News magazine by that specific title, The Pharaoh of the Exodus. He put a focus on Amenhotep II, whose dates would fall around 1453 to 1419. And indeed, it may well be that if that particular approach to chronology is correct, Amenhotep II would indeed be the one. Now, I've made allusion to this in an earlier lecture, and I want to go back just for a moment because there are some interesting developments and perhaps watershed developments that will initiate some changes in the way that we look at chronology in the history of the ancient world, and specifically the history of the Egyptian peoples. The book, once again, I've showed you this before, is by David Rohl, and Rohl's book, the British version here, titled A Test of Time, marketed in the United States under a somewhat different title, Pharaohs and Kings, and then there's also a BBC British television or video series that goes along with it. Rohl has proposed some radical revisions in terms of the Egyptian chronology, which is the framework that allows us to place these names that I've just mentioned and that we've looked at here with the events of the Exodus. It's too early to tell whether Rohl's chronology is going to make a major revision necessary. However, just in passing, let me add a chronological note here. Rohl proposes a new chronology for Egyptian history, and it shifts the time frame of Egyptian chronology, placing it somewhat along the lines that I'll verbally sketch for you. It's all very nicely detailed and justified and explained in fairly persuasive terms in the volume that I just showed you. But Rohl would place the Egyptian dynasty, the 12th dynasty, in the time frame of the 17th century BC, which again, that's the time frame that we would associate with Joseph's 22-year period in Rohl's chronology, probably 1684 to 1662, his first 22 years in Egypt. Then the 13th dynasty would be the period of Israel's sojourn in Egypt, 1662 to around the time of 1447 or thereabouts. The Hyksos period, which would follow after that, would be coincident with the time of Israel's wanderings in the wilderness for around 40 years, with the conquest of the land of Canaan, and about the first half of the period of the Judges, 1447 to around 1290 or so BC. The 15th dynasty likewise would overlap with the period of the Judges. The 18th dynasty would roughly coincide around the time of the judge known as Jephthah through about the first half, let's say, of King Solomon's reign, bringing it to around 950 BC. And then finally the 19th dynasty, which in large part has a lot to do with the revision, the way that Rohl reworks the chronology. The last half of Solomon's reign would fall within the framework of the 19th dynasty through the time of Solomon, Jeroboam, and Rehoboam, and the breakup of the kingdom, which we'll talk about in a good bit more extensive detail as we work our way through these lectures in Unit 5. Now, let me interject here what I'll describe as the Egyptian vignette, a little story with some comments on, well, not hardcore proof, not smoking pistols that make us say, that's it. We now know with absolute certainty that we can find Israel among the Anglo-American peoples today, but rather interesting coincidences, little waymarks along the way that provide interesting signs, almost clues, markers, as we try to trace the pathway of Israel into modern times. Egypt, as I've already mentioned, was the crucible in which the national people, which Israel grew into a nation. They grew into a people within that setting. For a couple of centuries, the Israelites were in the Egyptian culture and framework. Taking it a step even further backward, something that we mentioned in earlier lectures, Joseph's children themselves were half Egyptian. They were an interesting blend between royal Egyptian blood from Egypt. In terms of the Egyptian connection, it is said that the daughter of Potiphar was the mother of Joseph's children. Let's see here, I do have my notes are lost there, at least they're out of page order. Potiphar, the prince of On, Genesis 41 and verse 45, and you may have read that particular passage before. Let's just look at it. Genesis 41. This comes in the broader setting of the story of Pharaoh taking Joseph out of prison and elevating him in rank to, in essence, serve as prime minister over the entire nation. Verse 45, Pharaoh called Joseph's name, and then you have this long changed name, Zaphnath-Paaneah, and he gave to him a wife of Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, the priest, it says, but this the more likely translation is the prince, in other words, Egyptian royalty of On. And Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. Joseph then married into Egyptian royalty. Another sidelight, I may have mentioned this as well before, but it's worth repeating, is one tradition among the Hebrews is that Joseph actually married the daughter of the woman who had tried to seduce him way back at the beginning of the story, whenever Joseph was serving as the chief of staff in the house of Potiphar. And there you have one of those ironic twists of fate in the biblical story, as so often you do see it as a kind of Haman quality that you read about also in the book of Esther. Here Joseph retained his godly values, refused to commit fornication or adultery, depending on the perspective you look at it from, with the wife of his master. And in the long run, he receives the opportunity to marry the daughter of the woman who indeed tried to seduce him. In any event, it's very likely, to repeat once more, that Jacob formerly adopted Ephraim and Manasseh. Genesis chapter 48, verse 5, let my name be named on them, let them become unto me as Simeon and Reuben and Simeon. That was probably done lest the other claimants, the other children outside of Joseph's family, at some point in the future, especially after the death of Jacob, would come back and try to lay claim to the Abrahamic promise and the birthright, to challenge in particular the sons of Joseph on the grounds of their ethnicity or with charges about ethnic purity and the like. It is interesting that in the Bible that you have at least a couple of allusions to the Ephraimite descendants of Joseph, tying them to the Egyptians. Isaiah 23 is one of those examples. Isaiah 23 and verse 3, by the great waters, the seed of Sihor, the Nile River, the harvest of the river is her revenue, and she is the mart or the market of nations. And this is spoken of with an implication that ties together the Israelites, the Ephraimite family, to its Egyptian origins. Hosea chapter 11 would be another example of this kind of thing. Hosea 11, beginning in verse 1, when Israel was a child, then I loved him, and I called my son out of Egypt. Here again, going back to those lectures on the hermeneutics of prophecy, you have multiple applications at different levels. In my particular Bible here, this has, as my Old Testament passages do, whenever there's a prophecy of Messiah, a star in the margin. And there's a big star here about calling my son out of Egypt. And it's a forecast of calling Jesus Christ out of Egypt after Joseph and Mary took him there for protecting him from the purge or the pogrom that Herod initiated, trying to kill the king of the Jews before he had a chance to grow up. But it also has reference to things on the physical national plane. As they called them, so they went from them. They sacrificed unto Baalim and burned incense unto graven images. And here's the Ephraimite connection. I taught Ephraim also to go, taking them by their arms, but they knew not that I healed them. And there's that connection of being in Egypt and being brought out of Egypt. Now, with that in mind, and still within the context of this Egyptian vignette, there are some interesting telltale signs, call them what you may, in terms of American heraldry, and also, for that matter, monumental donations or gifts that bring our minds back to the Egyptian connection. One of all places we find on the American dollar bill. And if you turn a dollar bill over, if you're listening to these courses on audio tape, I'm holding a dollar bill before the video camera. But if you look at the back side of the dollar bill, what you're going to find, as you look to the left, is some startling Egyptian imagery. And there's much that's been made out of this. Probably my favorite book would be the one by John Hardin Allen on the national number and heraldry of the United States of America. Charles Adele Lewis Totten also had some fascinating insights into this particular kind of thing, although I would say Totten's work gets a little bit more on the the subjective, the conjectural, and perhaps even wild speculation, as opposed to Allen's work that's a little more disciplined and academic and responsible. But just looking at the bill itself, if you'll take a look, you find prominently displayed an Egyptian symbol, that of the Great Pyramid of Giza, the one without the capstone on top. And this, by the way, is the obverse or the reverse side of the Great Seal of the United States of America. If you look at the motto, the language at the top of the seal, it's Annuit Coptus, which means he, implying the divine being, has prospered our undertakings. And at this point I'll interject, the name of Joseph itself, the meaning of that is to increase or to be prosperous, or an implication simply of prosperity. Under the motto, as I've said, you find the Great Pyramid of Giza. Where the capstone is missing, you have the eye, the all-seeing eye, which connotes a kind of divine overseeing presence, an attention of God to the fortunes of the United States of America. And when you read and understand our history, it's hard to deny that there have been some remarkable things which have led to our people enjoying the kind of success that we have. Now, if you look on the other side, well, I'm sorry, not on the other side, it's encircling actually the eye, you have what is oftentimes described as the glory cloud. It's reminiscent of the pillar of cloud leading Israel out of Egypt. And I'll give you some additional information here in just a moment about how some of this imagery and symbolism was incorporated whenever the Great Seal of the United States of America was initially determined and established by those people who were commissioned to determine what our national seal would be. Then finally, at the bottom of the Latin Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order of the ages, the motto, and then at the bottom of the pyramid. That motto is fascinating because it implies the coming of a new world order. It has almost a millennial connotation. And when we understand and realize, as we've talked about in some of the previous lectures, that what we apparently live in the midst of is one of those forerunners heralding or forecasting the millennial conditions, the abundance. And in this section of lectures, we'll go back again and talk in greater detail, examining some of the main scriptures, both about Solomon's kingdom and prophetically about the millennial kingdom of Jesus Christ, and show what kind of overlap there is there. In many respects, the history of the Anglo-American peoples is the same type of forerunner. Not that we are perfect. We have not been. And as was the case with Jacob and many of his dishonorable ways of going about trying to lay hands on the birthright to ensure that he would get it. No, we've not done that. Christ has not established his kingdom yet. He will. And when he does, things will be done in a more honorable, respectable, orderly, and godly fashion. But in that sense, you have then these various allusions on the obverse side of the national seal of the United States of America. Now, the Egyptian imagery in the minds of those responsible for creating the new United States of America was very prominent. Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams, three of our most prominent forefathers, were on the original committee to create the seal, which is pictured on the dollar bill, the backside of the dollar bill. We still have access to some of the sketches and drawings. Benjamin Franklin had a design which he proposed be included with Moses lifting a rod, dividing the Red Sea, with Pharaoh and his hosts being overwhelmed in the background. And although this design was never adopted, again, going back to the dollar bill of today, this pillar of cloud, which was incorporated into the seal that we do have, it managed to survive the process of editing and become a part of the seal that we know and recognize today. Thomas Jefferson had his ideas as well about what the obverse or the backside of the seal should represent. He wanted to have included on it the liberated Israelites in the wilderness, again being led by that cloud during the day and by a pillar of fire at night. So these American forefathers, now I'm not by any stretch suggesting that they made the connection in the way that we make the connection here in this lecture series, but at least they saw a striking parallel between the Israelite experience of Egyptian bondage and what they perceived as their own colonial bondage or mistreatment under the tyrannical, as they saw him, King George III of England. They looked at him as being very much the same kind of individual, cut out of the same bolt of cloth as the Pharaoh of Egypt. In part 2 of the lecture series, we'll come back and look in greater detail at the history of the American Revolution, and there may be more to some of those parallels than we might immediately suspect. Now, two other remnants of Egypt that stand as testimony or maybe even witness to our Egyptian heritage and background, our roots and origin. They were gifts to the respective recipients, the British government and the American government, from the Viceroy of Egypt, a man named Muhammad Ali, not to be confused with the American boxer of the 20th century. Muhammad Ali lived 1769 to 1849. He was Viceroy over Egypt, and he gave as a gift 2 obelisks, one to the English people and the other to the American people. They are magnificent structures. I've seen one, the other I've not seen. One is in London, the other is in New York City. They are made out of solid red granite. They come from the Temple of On, which is in the ancient city of Memphis. And you may remember that Joseph married into the family of what? The Prince of On. One stands prominently on the banks of the Thames River in London. And at my first visit to the British Isles, I had an opportunity to go down and photograph it and also examine it and so on. It's not too far from Parliament there in the city of London itself. The other is in New York City's Central Park, and it stands in front of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. These are known oftentimes as Cleopatra's Needles, although that's a bit of an anachronism. They were not monuments erected by Cleopatra as such. They are reminders of a people coming out of the land of Egypt and our Israelitish heritage and the time that we spent there. They are interesting curiosities, not meaning to make more than we should out of them, but it is a fascinating reminder to that period way back when Israel really grew into a nation of its own right instead of just an extended family. Now, leaving that little vignette behind, let us go on then and talk at least a little bit about the Exodus and the conquest. I want to get at least a little bit of that covered and bring us up to probably about the time of the United Monarchy, and then we'll come back on lecture number 11 and begin there. Around the year 1443 BC, as best as we've been able to discern or reckon at this point, the departure from Egypt took place. It was in the context of the spring holy day season, the Passover, and the days of unleavened bread. The Israelites spent a period of 40 years from that point until the time they entered the Promised Land, the wilderness years, as you may style them. That brings us to around the year 1403. And over a 7-year span, then, Joshua and the armies of Israel began to occupy the Promised Land in the period of Israelite history that we would call the conquest. And in around 1397 or thereabouts, the land of Canaan, the Promised Land, was divided up by Joshua and portioned out to the various families according to the way that we read in the book of Numbers that the land was to be allocated. A comment or two in that regard. There is good evidence that Joshua's conquest was successful, but only to one certain extent or degree. There was victory in the main areas over the Canaanite concentration of populations, the main stronghold of resistance. But, and we get this as we read the accounts and see certain contrasts, which many in critical scholarly circles would argue that you have two different versions of the same story. Both cannot be true. One, a kind of lightning blitzkrieg type campaign as recorded in the book of Joshua. And then in the book of Judges, a kind of piecemeal taking of the land and ultimately a relinquishing of much of the choice portions, and especially the cities of that land, back to the original Canaanite inhabitants in this period that's described in the book of Judges. The answer, simply stated, and perhaps someday through the auspices of CBE, we may do a course on Israel, or ancient Israel, similar to what we used to do at Ambassador University. But the way in which we answered that, and the best answer that I have ever seen, is much like the Gulf War in the early 1990s, with its unfinished business in Iraq. The Israelites simply failed to follow through on their victory, to extinguish, as God told them in Deuteronomy 7. You need to drive the inhabitants out of the land. Don't leave a vestige there. Well, the Israelites failed to do so, leaving those enemies to live, to fight, to restructure, to rebuild another day. And ultimately, you have this long and protracted, awful, ugly period of the Judges, where Israel is on again, off again, at the mercy of the various native populations round about. The death of Joshua, my colleague, Mr. Kaplan, Mark Kaplan, who has produced a course which you can order through the CBE on Introduction to the Old Testament. This is his workbook, our study guide for that course. It comes also with a workbook as well. But he would date the death of Joshua around 1378, followed by the period of rulership of those elders who overlived Joshua, ranging up from around 1378 to 1357. From there, 1357 to around the establishment of the Saulite monarchy in, let's say, 1048, you have the period of the Judges, a terrible and a tragic period in Israelite history where the centrifugal forces of tribalism literally tore at the fabric of national unity, with there not being a centralized government and a king there. So Israel spent about 400 years from the arrival of the Israelites in 1403 Really, well, if you date it to the establishment of the United Kingdom or monarchy, 355 years to 1048 when Saul became king. But really unity did not come until you get down into the early years of David's reign, making it around a 400-year span before Israel finally established itself as the dominant force in the land of Canaan. That really didn't occur until the reign of David ben Jesse. Well, that will be it for this lecture. Next time we'll come back and we'll pick up our discussion taking a look at this interesting 120 or so year period known as the United Kingdom or the United Monarchy.